Kellen was supposed to die in that frozen alley, bleeding, hunted, and cornered with nowhere left to run. The Alpha King had only minutes before his enemies found him. Then a 6-year-old boy appeared through the snow and gave him his last piece of bread. That single act of kindness led Kellen into a humble bakery, where a fearless mother hid him beneath flour and cinnamon without knowing she had just saved a king. But as Kellen begins to fall for Elise and discovers the little boy's eyes carry a secret he can't ignore, danger closes in. A forgotten love from 7 years ago resurfaces. A deadly betrayal reaches the royal palace, and the woman who once saved his life may soon stand at the center of his throne. But when Kellen finally reveals who he truly is, Elise must decide whether to forgive the king who left her, or walk away forever. Kellen's knees hit the frozen cobblestones before he decided to fall. Blood had soaked through his coat an hour ago, and the cold had finished what the wound started. Behind him, boots crunched steadily through the snow, unhurried, the pace of men who already knew where a cornered wolf would run. Ahead, the alley narrowed to a dead wall between 2 shuttered shops. No door, no gate, no way through. Snow kept falling clean and thick over the rooftops, the kind that made a street look prettier than any street had a right to look while a man bled out in it. He almost laughed at the unfairness of that. He was going to die 3 streets from his own throne, and none of his guards would ever think to look here. A small shape rounded the corner instead, dragging a basket too heavy for its arms. The boy stopped. He stared at Kellen with the frank, unguarded curiosity only children still had, taking in the blood soaking dark through his coat, and the way his hands shook where they pressed against the wound. Then, without a word of warning, he dug into the basket and pulled out one last roll, still warm enough to steam faintly in the cold, and pushed it into Kellen's hands. Kellen, who had survived a father's death, a war of succession, and an ambush that had already cost him 2 guards, found his throat closing around nothing at all. A child, alone in a snowstorm, and plainly hungry himself, had just given a bleeding stranger the last of what little he had. He opened his mouth to refuse it. "Keep it," the boy said. "You look hungrier than me." Then he spun toward a doorway, spilling gold light across the snow. "Mom," he shouted. "I finished the delivery. There's a big guy falling over out here, covered in red syrup. I gave him my last roll, so come carry him inside before he bleeds on it." Kellen remained kneeling in the snow, the warm bread held uselessly in one hand, and found himself more stunned by the child than by the men still hunting him. The doorway belonged to a bakery, windows fogged gold with heat, and the woman who came through it moved like she had done this before. Not the specific business of hauling a bleeding stranger off the street, the general business of handling emergencies without losing her nerve. She took one look at Kellen, one look at the alley behind him, and didn't ask a single question before crouching to haul his arm over her shoulder. Leo. The door latched after between the 2 of them. Mother and son. They got him inside just as the first pursuers turned into the alley. The bakery swallowed him in warmth and the smell of butter and cinnamon, and it was almost worse than the cold how badly his body wanted to stay. "Flour bin," the woman said. "Already moving. Now." He didn't argue. He folded himself into the wooden bin behind the counter, and she buried him under a drift of flour before dumping a fistful of crushed spice over the top. Cinnamon, clove, something sharper underneath that stung his eyes, and he registered with distant approval, would smother the smell of his own blood from anything hunting by scent. Fists hit the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Muffled through the flour, Kellen heard the boy's voice pitch up bright and helpful. "A man? No, nobody came through here. But I saw somebody running toward the tree line, past the old well real fast. Maybe he went that way." A pause. The latch shifted once beneath a testing hand. Someone on the other side drew a slow breath, searching for blood beneath the cinnamon and clove. Nothing. A man muttered at last. He went for the trees, boots, several pairs, wheeling off toward the forest at a dead run. The door didn't open again. Kellen lay buried in flour and spice for what felt like a small eternity. listening to his own pulse and the muffled sounds of a bakery closing itself up for the night around him. A bolt sliding home, a chair scraping back into place, the woman's low voice telling the boy he'd done well and ought to be proud of himself. He'd spent his whole life learning to read a room through walls. This was the first time in longer than he could say that what he'd read through one had been kindness instead of a threat. By the time Elise pulled him out of the flower, Kellen's coat had gone stiff with drying blood, and he'd stopped being able to feel his own hands. She worked fast and quiet, cutting away torn cloth, pressing a clean rag hard against the worst of it, and it was somewhere in the middle of that. Her hands steady on his ribs, her hair coming loose from its knot, that his wolf did something it hadn't done in longer than he could remember. It sat up. It paid attention as if some instinct he'd stopped listening to years ago had caught a scent it recognized but couldn't yet name. He didn't understand it, and he didn't trust things he didn't understand, so he set it aside and looked instead at the boy hovering by her elbow, wide-eyed and useless in the specific way of children desperate to help. The boy's eyes were dark gold, flecked at the center. Kellen knew that exact color. He saw it every morning in the mirror. He said nothing. He filed it away next to the wolf's strange attention. In the growing list of things about this bakery he had no explanation for. And when Elise finished binding his ribs and asked, not unkindly, who he was and who'd been chasing him, he gave her the easiest lie available. No one, he said. A drifter. Wrong place. Wrong debt collectors. He let his voice rasp. Let the exhaustion do the rest of the work. I have nowhere else to go tonight. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had nowhere else he could go. Not with assassins combing the streets for a king who was supposed to already be dead. And not with a boy in this kitchen whose eyes were an accusation he hadn't yet earned the right to ask about. Elise studied him a moment too long, weighing a stranger's blood on her floor against a child's insistence that he'd needed saving. You can stay in the storeroom, she said finally, until you're steady enough to walk. After that, you're someone else's problem. Kellen, Alpha, king of a throne currently in someone else's very capable hands, agreed to become the problem of a woman half his size with flour in her hair, and found he didn't mind the demotion nearly as much as he should have. Outside, the winter town had settled into its usual brightness. Lantern-strung eaves, a snowman leaning drunk against the well, children shrieking their way across packed white streets. The kind of pretty little town that never quite matched the danger currently keeping to Elise's storeroom. By the second week, she'd stopped bothering to lie to herself about how much wood a drifter passing through was supposed to chop. Kellen split logs like a man working off a debt he couldn't name, hauled flour sacks 2 at a time up from the cellar, and stood at her elbow every morning waiting to be told what to do next, as if idleness were a language he'd never learned to speak. He was terrible at needing too much force and not enough patience dough torn instead of folded. Work it, she told him, guiding his hands flat against the counter. Everything I've fought until now has needed fighting. Not this. She pressed his palms down. Turn. Fold. Again. Let it tell you when it's ready. He kept at it, sleeves shoved up, flour ghosting pale across his forearms, muttering at the dough like it had personally wronged him. Until 3 days later, without announcing it, his hands finally learned the give of it. She told herself she kept him around for the extra pair of hands. The palace selection was still several weeks away, and if her bakery won the contract to supply the royal midwinter feast, it would mean a new roof before spring, the last of her debts paid, and 1 whole year when Leo wouldn't have to hear her doing sums by candlelight after he'd gone to bed. She needed the hands. That was all it was. You're burning it again, she said. Not looking up from the dough she was shaping, Kellen swore under his breath, low and startled. Nothing like the careful drifter's manners he usually wore, and yanked the tray from the oven a beat too late. The loaves inside had gone from gold to a deep, unsalvageable brown along 1 whole edge. The fire runs hotter on this side. It runs hotter on that side every single day. You've had 2 weeks to learn where to turn the tray. I'm learning. He set the ruined loaves on the cooling rack anyway, and didn't throw them out. which was how she found out 3 nights later that he'd been quietly eating his own burnt failures instead of wasting them without once mentioning it. Leo, for his part, had appointed himself Kellen's official taste tester and unofficial thief. He'd taken to smuggling the best honey rolls off the cooling rack, the ones with the glossiest glaze, the ones Elise had been planning to sell, and pressing them into Kellen's hands whenever he thought she wasn't looking. She was always looking. She never said anything. The coming selections sat over all of it like weather she couldn't control. When the palace judges finally arrived, they would taste whatever the town's bakeries put in front of them, and choose exactly one to supply the midwinter feast. Elise had already decided on spiced apple tarts and honey-glazed rolls, the 2 things her mother had taught her before her hands were even big enough to hold the rolling pin properly, and she spent whole evenings testing ratios of cinnamon to clove, while Kellen turned wood into kindling in the yard, and Leo narrated his opinion of each batch with the blunt honesty only a 6-year-old could get away with. "That one's better," he announced around a mouthful of the 4th attempt. "The other one tasted like you were arguing with the clove." "I was not arguing with the clove." "You were a little bit arguing with the clove." Kellen, leaning in the doorway with a load of wood still balanced against one hip, didn't bother hiding that he was laughing at her. He'd taken to letting Leo stack the smaller logs after he split them, showing him with more patience than Elise had ever seen him spend on anything else how to lay them so the pile wouldn't slide. Leo took the job with tremendous seriousness, narrating each log's placement like a general directing troops, and Kellen answered every one of his solemn pronouncements with an equally solemn nod, never once laughing at him the way he laughed at her. "That one goes on the bottom," Leo informed him. "It's the biggest. Biggest ones hold up the little ones." "A sound principle," Kellen said. "I made it up myself." I could tell it was harder some nights to remember this was supposed to be temporary. A stranger passing through until his ribs healed, and the men hunting him lost interest. When she found herself, without deciding to, setting out 3 bowls for supper instead of 2, she caught herself doing it again that evening, ladle in hand, before she'd even registered pulling the 3rd bowl down from the shelf. Kellen didn't say anything about it either. He just sat down at the table like it was where he'd always sat, like the space had been shaped for him before he arrived, and asked Leo about his day, and listened to the answer like it mattered. By the fire that night, with Leo asleep against Kellen's side and the last of the good bread cooling on the sill, the whole room smelling faintly of wood smoke and cinnamon, Kellen stopped mid-thought and simply watched the flames for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. "What?" Elise asked. "Nothing." He shifted, careful not to wake Leo. "I don't think I've sat still like this in longer than I can say. Not since before my father died." Maybe. She didn't ask what he meant by that. She had a feeling the answer would complicate things she wasn't ready to have complicated. And for once in her life, she let a question go unasked in favor of the fire, the bread, and the quiet. Chapter 2. Ed Voss came by the bakery twice a week, always with flowers a day past their prime, and a smile that assumed too much. He was a merchant of some means in the lower town, and he decided, with the unshakable confidence of a man who'd never once been told no by anyone who mattered, that Elise owed him gratitude for his attention. He liked to remind her in the same breath as his compliments that she wasn't young anymore, that she came with a child already attached, and that a bakery run by a lone woman would never once catch the eye of the palace. "No matter how good her bread was, you could do worse than my household," he told her, examining her shelves like a man pricing livestock. "I wouldn't need you to be anything but sensible about it." "I'm perfectly sensible," Elise said, not looking up from her ledger. "Sensible enough to know an insult wrapped as a compliment when I hear one. I only mean you'd want for nothing. I don't want for anything now. Master Voss, except perhaps quieter mornings." He laughed like she'd meant it as flattery instead of a door closing, and left the wilted flowers on her counter anyway, as if the gesture mattered more than whether she'd asked for it. Elise had learned to let comments like that slide past her the way you learn to let sleet slide off a good coat. Leo hadn't learned that yet, and didn't seem inclined to. Every time Voss came through the door, Leo abandoned whatever he was doing and planted himself in front of his mother, small and stubborn and entirely unable to actually block anyone from anything. Kellen watched it happen 3 times before he said a word about it. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to Elise. "He's 6, Kellen said quietly, watching Leo's narrow back through the doorway. "And he's already decided it's his job to stand between you and anyone who might hurt you. He's stubborn," Elise said. The rest of the sentence caught in her throat, and she went back to her dough. Kellen didn't finish it for her, but his jaw set hard and quiet, and it stayed that way for the rest of the afternoon. The day it went wrong, Voss made the mistake of looking straight at Leo and calling him a fatherless bastard. Loud enough for the whole shop to hear, in the same tone he'd have used to point out a crack in a jug. The room's temperature didn't change. Nothing so simple as that. Kellen's eyes flashed wolf gold for a heartbeat. The oven gave a low, unhappy hiss, and a fine skin of frost bloomed across the inside of the window glass. Voss took an involuntary step backward, the way a man steps back from a dog he'd forgotten was capable of biting. Kellen hadn't moved. He hadn't raised his voice. He was still standing by the flour sacks with his arms full, and somehow that made it worse. Voss left without his flowers. Leo looked up at Kellen after the door shut, eyes bright in a way Elise hadn't seen before, something between awe and recognition, like he'd just watched someone confirm a suspicion he'd been carrying alone for a while. Neither of them named it, but the alliance showed up in small ways. Leo left his wooden practice sword propped conspicuously by the door whenever Voss was expected, while Kellen found reasons to split wood within sight of the front window at the hours Voss usually called. They understood each other without needing to discuss it. It announced itself properly 3 days later when Voss came back. Leo had gotten to the doorstep first, with a jar of bacon grease and the focused seriousness of a boy conducting sacred business. Kellen simply stood at the back of the shop, arms crossed, watching, saying nothing, radiating the specific stillness of a very large predator that had decided to let something else spring the trap. Voss's first step onto the threshold went out from under him entirely. He hit the floor in a spray of wilted petals, scrambled up, cursing, and fled without once looking back. While Leo doubled over, laughing so hard he had to hold on to the counter. Kellen didn't laugh, but he caught himself smiling into the flour sacks where no one could see it, and he didn't bother trying to stop. Elise found the two of them like that when she came back from the market. Leo, still gasping between fits of laughter, and Kellen wearing an expression she'd never once seen on him before, something close to pride, though he'd have denied it if she'd asked. What happened here? Nothing, Leo said entirely unconvincingly, and Kellen said nothing at all, which told her everything. From then on, whenever he split a portion of soup or bread between the 3 of them, Leo's bowl always came out a little fuller than his own. Voss's pride didn't survive the bacon grease, and men whose pride doesn't survive a public humiliation rarely let the matter end there. For 4 days, nothing happened at all, which should have been the first warning. Elise noticed a stranger loitering near the well one afternoon, gone by the time she looked twice. Kellen noticed the same man, or one dressed the same, and said nothing, because naming a worry before it arrived rarely made a household sleep any better. On the 4th night, the front door came off its top hinge in a single kick, and 3 men Elise had never seen in her life came through it, swinging clubs like they'd been paid enough not to care whose bakery this was. She had time to grab Leo and nothing else before Kellen was already between them and the door, putting his own body squarely in the gap between the counter and the wall, where the 3 of them would have to come through him to reach either her or her son. He didn't shift. His fingers curled, his nails lengthening toward claws before he forced them back. The bakery was too small, and Leo stood only a few feet behind him, instead. Kellen fought with his own hands, even through the chaos. Elise noticed that he reacted before the men fully moved, turning at the scrape of a boot or the hitch of breath that came just before a swing. Whoever he was, he had done this many times before, in rooms far worse than hers. The bakery was small, and Kellen used the narrow space like a blade, putting bodies where they blocked each other instead of him. He drove the first man into the counter with his elbow before the second had cleared the doorway. When the second came in low for his knees, Kellen turned the man's weight against him and slammed him face first into the cooling racks, sending loaves across the floor. The third swung wide at open space instead of a target, the kind of clumsy fury that got people hurt faster than skill ever did. 2 men down, 1 still standing, and for 1 dangerous second, Kellen's attention split between finishing the fight and checking that Elise and Leo hadn't moved from the corner he'd put them in. That second was enough. The last man got a club swing in anyway, aimed low and mean, straight at Leo, where he'd wriggled half out of Elise's grip to see what was happening. Kellen took it instead. He turned his shoulder into a blow meant for a 6-year-old's skull, and Elise heard the wet tear as the wound over the same rib reopened beneath his shirt. He didn't go down. He put the man on the floor a second later and stood over him, breathing hard, blood soaking fresh through old bandages, and he didn't let a single one of them get close enough to Leo or Elise to try again. When the last one fled, Kellen stayed standing in the wreckage of her front counter for a long moment, chest heaving, before his knees finally admitted what his will had been refusing to. She bandaged him at the kitchen table that night, hands steadier than she felt, while Leo sat pressed against Kellen's other side, refusing to be sent to bed. "You didn't have to take that hit," she said, working the cloth tight around his ribs. "Yes, I did." He said it so simply, like there'd never been another option worth considering, that she had to stop and just look at him for a moment. This man who'd walked into her bakery bleeding and lying about his own name, currently letting her tie off a wound he'd taken meant for her son. The air between them had gone different somehow, warmer, though she couldn't have said exactly when. Maybe it was the wound. Maybe it was the 2 weeks before it. The burnt bread and the third bowl at supper, and Leo's honey rolls disappearing into Kellen's pockets. Maybe it was just this, his eyes catching hers over the lamplight, and neither of them looking away first, the silence stretching out comfortable and terrifying in equal measure. "Thank you," she said. Which wasn't enough, and they both knew it. "Don't." Not for that. His voice had gone low. "I'd do worse than take a club for either of you. You don't owe us that." She tied off the last of the bandage, not quite looking at him. "You're not obligated to bleed for a bakery. You're only passing through." "I know exactly what I'm obligated to do," Kellen said. "This isn't that." She finished the bandage without answering because she didn't trust her voice to stay steady, and when she finally looked up again, he was watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, though she recognized the shape of it, the way you recognize a language you haven't spoken since childhood. Leo, half asleep against Kellen's side, mumbled something about the bad men in pastries, and neither of the adults corrected him. Chapter 3. Sable lived at the end of the lane, and had wanted the corner plot long before Elise opened the bakery. She had never quite forgiven Elise for getting it instead. Kellen's arrival gave the old grudge a new shape to wear. She found excuses to pass by the woodpile most afternoons, watching him work with an attention that had nothing to do with admiring his form and everything to do with deciding how to use him. "She's not even young anymore," Sable said one afternoon, leaning on the fence like she'd been invited. "And that boy of hers. Everyone knows there's no father in that picture. Why waste yourself splitting wood for a woman like that?" Because she asked, and I said, "Yes." Kellen didn't look up from the axe. "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." He split the next log clean down the center. "Careful. You're talking about people I'd take badly to hear insulted twice. You'd defend a woman who isn't even yours." Sable folded her arms, chin up. The particular brittleness of someone who decided rejection was easier to survive as contempt. "I could give you better than a drafty bakery and someone else's brat underfoot. I didn't ask for better." He set the next log on the block without looking at her. "I asked you to leave." She left in a temper. He thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, the water skin he kept by the woodpile tasted faintly bitter under the cold. An aftertaste he registered and dismissed as nothing more than the well running low again, and by the time the wrongness of it hit his blood in full, it was already too late to spit it back out. Moonfire took him the way a fever takes a man already worn thin, fast from the inside out. His skin burned, his pulse hammered near his throat. Every sound in the yard sharpened past bearing. The ring of the axe, the creak of the fence, a dog barking 3 streets off, and beneath it all ran an ugly, insistent pull toward wanting, toward touching, toward anyone close enough to reach. He dropped the axe before his own hands could decide what to do with it, and that frightened him more than the fever did. Sable was close enough to reach. She'd clearly planned it that way, appearing at the fence in considerably less than she usually wore. Watching him sweat through his shirt with open satisfaction, she stepped closer. Kellen's wolf, drugged half out of its mind, recoiled from her like she was something rotten. That was the one mercy Moonfire could not touch. Kellen did not yet understand what Elise was to him, and the bond had not fully awakened. But his wolf already knew. The drug could sharpen wanting. It could not make Sable the answer. "You're wasting your time." He groaned out, barely words at all by the end of it, backing toward the fence like a man trying to put a wall between himself and his own hands. She didn't listen. She reached for him anyway. He roared, more animal in it than he'd allowed himself to sound in years, and shoved her back hard enough that she went down into the snow with a startled cry. He didn't wait to see her get up. He ran, stumbling and half blind, boots skidding on packed ice, one shoulder dragging along a fence rail he couldn't see clearly enough to avoid. The cold should have helped, but it didn't. Nothing in him could tell fever from frost anymore, for once. Warmth and distance from Sable lay in the same direction, somewhere past the burning under his skin and the pulse hammering wrong in his throat. One thought stayed lit and clear enough to steer by. The bakery, the gold window. The only place his body still agreed was safe. The back door slammed open so hard it cracked against the wall, and for one wild second, Elise thought the men from 4 nights ago had come back with reinforcements. It was Kellen, alone, soaked through with sweat despite the cold. Moving like something in him was fighting something else for control of his own legs. He didn't come towards her. He went straight past her to the flower store room, hauled the door shut behind himself, and dragged the heavy shelving unit across it from the inside, barring himself in, not her out. "Stay back," he said through the door, his voice wrecked and barely his own. "Elise, stay back from me." Every sensible instinct told her to listen. Instead, she went for cold water, the fever herbs from her shelf, and the length of silver chain she kept by the oven for exactly this kind of trouble, though she'd never once expected to need it on a man she'd started, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, to care about far more than was sensible. "What happened to you?" she said, low through the gap under the door. "Sable?" The word came out half a snarl. "Something in the water. I need you to leave. I can't trust what I am right now. I'm not leaving. Elise." "Don't." "I said I'm not leaving." She hung the silver chain across the door frame close enough to remind him of the line, and sat down on the floor with her back against the wood as close to him as she dared. "Talk to me instead." He talked or tried to ragged, half-formed sentences about heat and pressure and a war he was losing by degrees, and every time his voice frayed apart entirely. She said his name, plain and steady, and something in his breathing would catch and slow again. Like her voice was the one rope still tethering him to himself. Once his voice dropped away entirely, for long enough that panic clawed up her throat before it started again. Rougher, further from himself than it had been. She kept talking through the gap under the door anyway, about nothing in particular. The shop, the selection, a customer who'd complained about the price of cinnamon that morning. Anything with enough ordinary weight to it that he'd have something plain to hold on to. It went on long enough that her own hands had gone numb from the cold floor before she finally heard the shelving unit scrape back. The door opened a crack. He looked wrecked, sweat-soaked, eyes gone dark and unsteady, but present, watching her with a kind of desperate focus that had nothing drugged about it at all. "Touch it," he said, and pulled his shirt aside enough to show the wound on his ribs, still raw from the club 4 nights past. "Please." "I don't know why." but I think it's you. I think you're the only thing tethering me right now." She hesitated only long enough to search his face. The moment her fingers found the edge of the wound, something ignited between them. It had nothing to do with fever, and everything to do with recognition. The bond snapped into place, sudden and enormous, like a rope pulled taut after years of slack. It did not burn the drug out of him, but it dragged his mind clear of the flood until he was entirely himself again. Kellen went very still. "I'm here," he said, and his voice had come back to him whole. "I see you. I know exactly where I am, and exactly who you are, and if you tell me to stop right now, I will walk out that door if I have to break my own arm to do it." Elise looked at him a long moment, flour-dusted, bleeding. More honest than she had ever seen Ina manage to be, and made her choice. She was the one who closed the distance. It was the firelight that gave the scar away, a thin, pale line beneath his collarbone she'd traced with her fingers without thinking, and something in the shape of it stopped her cold. "I've seen this before," she whispered. 7 years ago, on the night of the nameless moon. Silver smoke had covered the capital, smothering scent, blood, rank, and even a wolf's instinct for recognizing its mate. She'd worn a plain domino. He'd worn a silver wolf's face, carried this same scar, and looked at her like she was the only person in the crowded hall. He touched the ribbon at her wrist before she could finish the thought. The same faded band he'd tied there himself the night before he vanished without a word. "You," Kellen said, and it wasn't a question. "You," she said back, and it broke something open in her chest that had been sealed for 7 years. He told her in pieces, breath still uneven against her hair, that his father had died that same night, word reaching him in the middle of the masquerade. And he'd been called home before dawn with no time to find her first. By the time he'd come back searching, she was already gone. "I panicked," she admitted, tears finally slipping free. "A night like that, it felt like a dream I wasn't allowed to keep. So I ran before it could turn into anything real." "I looked for you afterward," Kellen said. "Quiet now." The last of the fever gone from his voice entirely. "I told myself I imagined half of it, because the alternative was believing I'd found you once and let you slip away. I told myself the same thing." Elise laughed unsteady and pressed her palm flat over the scar like she could still feel the mask beneath it. 7 years. And I still checked every silver-masked stranger at every festival since. So did I. The storeroom door stayed shut until well past midnight, and when the lamp finally guttered out. It was the first time in 7 years either of them had fallen asleep, without the weight of that lost night still pressing on their chests. The storeroom had gone quiet and gray with the first hour before dawn. When the knock came at the back door, 3 sharp raps. Deliberate. The kind a soldier gives when he already knows he's interrupting something, and has decided it doesn't matter. Kellen's captain found the bakery at first light. Nearly 3 weeks of searching etched into his face, and didn't bother softening what he'd come to say. The capital's in open revolt. Alpha King. The eastern gate won't hold past midday without you. How long have you been looking for me? Since the ambush. My king. The first 2 weeks were false reports and dead roads. 4 days ago, we found a trail we could trust near the old mill. We lost it twice in the drifts before it led us here. The captain's gaze cut briefly to the storeroom door and the flour still dusting Kellen's sleeves. He asked nothing further. Victor moved openly yesterday. The council is splitting, and his men already hold part of the East Gate house. If you don't return by midday, the capital may fall. Kellen stood in the doorway of the room where Elise still slept. One hand braced on the frame, and did the arithmetic he'd been dreading since the bond had settled into his chest like a second heartbeat. If he woke her now, told her everything, brought her and Leo with him today, they'd be riding straight into a city that hadn't yet finished deciding who its king even was, a target painted on both of them before he'd had the chance to protect either. He couldn't do that to them. Not yet. Whatever the bond now demanded of him. A king who brought war to his own mate's doorstep before he'd even told her what he was would be no kind of mate worth having. "Give me a moment," he told the captain, and crossed to the bed instead of turning for the door. He meant to wake her. He'd gotten as far as kneeling at the bedside, one hand halfway to her shoulder, when the captain's voice came again from the hall, low and urgent, the eastern gate. My king, every hour we lose is a street they take. If Victor's men hold it past noon, there may be no capital left worth returning her to. That decided it, though it didn't make the decision hurt any less. Kellen looked at Elise's sleeping face one more long moment, at the ribbon still tied loose around her wrist, at the piece on her that he was about to shatter twice in one lifetime. And he made the choice a king made, instead of the one a man wanted to. He untied the ribbon carefully from where it had slipped in the night and laid it back against her pillow, where she'd find it first before anything else. Not goodbye. The only promise he had time left to give. This time I come back. He was gone before the sun cleared the rooftops. Elise woke to an empty bed and a ribbon on the pillow. And for one terrible, suspended second. She thought she was 7 years younger, and none of the last 3 weeks had happened at all. She was out the door before she'd found her coat, snow soaking through her boots within a dozen steps, calling his name into a street that gave nothing back but wind. He was already gone. Not fled this time, she told herself. Not the same as before, but gone was gone regardless of the reason behind it. And her chest didn't much care about the difference. She stopped in the middle of the empty lane, sank into the snow, and buried her face against her knees. Then she finally let herself cry the way she had not allowed herself to cry 7 years ago. Loud, furious, and entirely without dignity. Her sobs swallowed the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. Then the snow stopped touching her for one impossible heartbeat. She thought Kellen had come back. She lifted her head through tears and found Leo standing on his toes, struggling to hold an umbrella far too large for him. He had angled it entirely over her, leaving his own small shoulders exposed to the falling snow. I couldn't find him either, Leo said. Matter of fact, in the way only a 6-year-old could manage in the middle of his mother's worst morning. But I found you. Elise reached for him and pulled him against her. The umbrella slipped sideways into the snow as Leo's small arms closed around her neck. She held him there for a long moment, crying into his wet coat while he clung to her without asking her to stop. Whatever Kellen was or was not, whatever this morning had cost her, she still had this much in her arms. When she could finally breathe again, she wiped her face, picked up the umbrella, pulled Leo beneath it, and turned them both toward home. Chapter 4. 3 weeks passed before the world outside the bakery caught up with what had happened inside it. The lane had grown quieter in that time. Sable had been taken for questioning after Elise told the town watch, whose name Kellen had managed to give her through the storeroom door, and Voss had stopped appearing at the bakery after one of the men from the attack was caught and named the merchant who had paid them. Neither absence felt quite like justice yet, but for the first time in months. Leo no longer checked the window every time Boots stopped outside. Word reached the lower town in pieces, the way it always did. The eastern gate retaken before noon, the rebellion broken by nightfall. And at the center of it all stood a king everyone had assumed too wounded to survive. Nobody agreed on the details. Lord Victor had escaped before the cordon closed, taking a scattered handful of loyalists with him. But victory traveled faster than unfinished business, and most of the city heard only that the fighting was over. Elise had her own reasons not to ask too many questions about which king exactly, or why every description of him kept sounding uncomfortably familiar. With the capital declared secure, the palace confirmed that the midwinter banquet would proceed as planned. Less a celebration than proof that order had returned. The palace judges had visited the bakery during those 3 quiet weeks, tasted Elise's spiced apple tarts and honey-glazed rolls, and left without revealing so much as a raised eyebrow. 3 days before the banquet, a royal courier arrived with a seal she'd never seen up close before. Her bakery had been chosen to provide the pastry course. For several seconds, Elise could only stare at the message. Voss had told her that a lone woman's bakery would never catch the palace's eye. Now the palace was asking her to walk through its gates, carrying the 2 recipes her mother had taught her. It should have felt like an uncomplicated victory. Mostly, though. It felt like walking toward a door she wasn't ready to open. Because a royal banquet meant a royal hall, and a royal hall meant a throne, and she still hadn't let herself finish the thought about who was likely sitting on it. On the afternoon of the banquet, Leo, delivering the first crate of pastries at his mother's side, had never seen a kitchen so big in his life, and lasted exactly as long as it took Elise to start unpacking crates before he wandered off toward what he was fairly sure was the direction of the honey stores. He didn't find the honey. He found a gap behind a wall of flour sacks instead, and ducked into it when he heard boots coming. 3 men in royal armor came through with a heavy chest between them, boots ringing off the stone floor, badges pinned upside down on their collars in a way Leo didn't understand, but knew was wrong. The way a picture hung crooked is wrong, even to someone who can't say why. They set the chest down hard enough that something inside it rattled. Jars against jars, and one of the men crouched to check the latch, while the other 2 kept watch on the corridor. Doors seal from outside the second the moon bell rings, one of them murmured, voice barely above the scrape of the chest across stone. Powder goes in the vents and the trays before then. By the time anyone smells it, the king won't be able to shift, won't be able to breathe right, and the rest of us walk in through the front like we own the place. And if the taster catches it first, he won't. It's milled fine as flour. Nobody in that kitchen looks twice at flour. Leo didn't understand rebellions or vents or moon bells. He understood 3 things, clear as anything. These men were bad. They meant to hurt the king in the great hall tonight, and the white powder in that chest wasn't his mother's flour. He waited until their boots faded down the corridor, heart going so hard he could hear it over his own breath. Then he crawled out and cracked the chest open. The jars inside looked almost exactly like the ones his mother used for flour. He swapped the poison jars one for one with matching jars of flour from her supply crate, working fast and clumsy. Halfway through the last jar, boots sounded again at the far end of the corridor. Leo froze with the lid still loose beneath his fingers. A shadow crossed the gap between the flour sacks, paused, then moved on when another guard called from the stair. Only when the shadow disappeared did Leo tighten the last lid, close the chest, and ease the latch back into place. Then he wrapped the poison jars tight in a cloth and ran, small legs pumping back toward the one adult who always knew what to do with a problem too big for him. Elise listened to her son's breathless, backward account of armored men and upside-down badges and swapped jars, and felt the floor of her understanding tilt sideways. This wasn't only poison meant for a king. This was a trap built to close every exit the moment the moon bell rang, sealing an entire hall of nobles inside with an enemy who'd already decided the outcome. She wrapped the real jars tighter beneath her apron and left Leo beside the pastry crates with strict instructions not to move. A kitchen servant pointed her toward the western stair where one of the palace guard captains was supposed to be stationed before the banquet began. Elise made it as far as the archway before a soldier stepped across it. His armor was royal. His badge was not. It sat upside down against his collar, exactly the way Leo had described. His smile came too quickly. The kitchen staff stay below. I need to speak to the captain. There are men inside the palace who shouldn't be here. Then tell me. His hand settled against the hilt at his side. Not a threat. Not openly. Just enough to make her look past him at the 2 soldiers posted farther along the stair. She didn't recognize either of them. One wore the same reversed badge. Beyond them, another unfamiliar guard stood at the corridor leading toward the great hall. Enough of the banquet stairs, service passages, and outer doors were already in enemy hands that any warning she gave here might reach the conspirators before it reached the king. Elise lowered her eyes like a baker who had been properly reminded of her place. "My mistake," she said. She turned away before the soldier could ask what she was carrying beneath her apron and did not breathe properly again until she had reached Leo. The false guards controlled the stairs and doors, but the kitchen still had to keep moving. Servants, carts, and sacks of flour passed through the lower corridors without drawing attention. Elise had no sword, no soldiers, no authority whatsoever inside a palace that would never think to ask a baker's opinion on anything more dangerous than sugar quantities. But she still had the poison jars. She had a son who had already ruined half the enemy's plan. And she had Flower. She knew exactly what Flower could do. Years ago, a careless handful too near an open oven mouth had sent a tongue of flame roaring up past her elbow, close enough to singe her sleeve and teach her a lesson she'd never once forgotten. Fine Flower, thick enough in the air, was as hungry for fire as any dry field in summer. She chose the finest mill sacks and loosened each seam. "Are we really doing this?" Leo whispered. "We're doing this. Stay by the corner if you see armor. Cough once and come straight back to me." At the rear of the storeroom, a service hoist used for banquet supplies ran to the narrow loft above the front hall, while Leo kept watch. Elise raised the sacks one at a time beneath the noise of the kitchens. Twice, his warning cough sent her reaching for the storeroom ledger until passing guards moved on. When the corridor cleared, she climbed to the loft, wedged the sacks above the great doors, threaded a single cord through the loosened seams of every sack, and ran its end behind a hanging tapestry. "What if it doesn't work?" Leo asked when she returned, small and serious, watching her test the cords give with one hand. "Then we'll think of something else." She tucked the last of the cord out of sight and looked at him properly. "But it's going to work. I know what Flower does better than anyone in this palace." When it was done, she checked the wall bracket beside the service curtain. A torch would be burning there once the banquet began, close enough to reach in a heartbeat. Her hands were still pale with flour dust. When she straightened, the tremor had left them. If anyone wanted into that hall tonight, they would have to come through her oven first. The great hall of the palace was lit gold and silver that night. Hearth fire banked high enough to warm marble, and lamps strung in careful rows. Along walls hung with banners for a piece nobody had quite finished earning. Nobles from every province filled the floor in furs and jewel-toned silk. Elise and Leo stood well back in the service corridor behind the kitchens, close enough to watch and far enough to be forgotten, she told herself, packing that last crate of pastries, that tonight was only about proving her bakery deserved the contract. She stopped believing that the moment the moon bell rang and every great door in the hall slammed shut at once, sealed from outside with a sound like the whole building exhaling. Armor rang out beyond the walls, claws scraped stone between the pounding boots, and more than one shouted order broke apart into a snarl. The remnant force the capital believed scattered poured into the front courtyard from every side. Masked, weapons drawn, some already half-shifted, an ambush that had clearly been waiting for exactly this signal. A man stepped out from behind the musicians at the edge of the floor and pulled away a plain black half-mask. Elise knew the face from the charcoal notices posted at the palace gates that afternoon. Lord Victor, the rebel commander who had escaped when the crown retook the eastern gate. He wore court black instead of a fugitive's cloak, and moved with the calm certainty of a man who already knew how many of the guards at the doors belonged to him. The palace had declared his war finished. Victor clearly had not. By now, Victor announced loud and satisfied enough to carry to every corner of the hall. The king should be choking on his own breath, unable to shift or call a shred of that aura he's so famous for. He smiled, slow and certain. A wounded king poisoned in his own banquet hall is nothing but prey waiting to be torn apart in front of the very nobles who think he still commands them. A throne belongs to the wolf strong enough to hold it, not to one crawling back from death's door on borrowed time. He raised a hand. The men stationed inside the hall in royal armor drew their weapons behind him, their reversed badges catching briefly in the firelight. The same sign Leo had described, beyond the sealed doors. The remnant force waiting in the courtyard answered with the ring of steel. Kellen rose from the throne instead. He didn't rise like a poisoned man. There was no stagger in it, no gasping fight for air, nothing at all like what Victor's whole plan had been built to guarantee. He came down the steps in black and silver, shoulders set, moving with a steadiness that made the room's confidence curdle in real time. Watching him cross the floor, Elise saw what 3 weeks in her kitchen had restored. Weight in his frame, steadiness in his stride, life where the alley had left almost none. Hot soup, honeyed bread, and evenings by a fire had not made him invulnerable. They had simply helped pull him back far enough to stand here now, walking toward a man who had been certain he was already dead. Victor's face went from certain to gray in the space of a single breath. By the time Kellen reached the foot of the steps, his eyes had gone fully wolf gold. Then Kellen's alpha aura broke loose across the hall like a black wave rolling downhill, and Elise felt it even from the service corridor, a pressure that pinned breath in every chest in the room and made the very lamp flames along the walls seem to gutter low, as if the air itself had gone thin. The false guards nearest Victor dropped first, weapons clattering out of hands gone suddenly nerveless. Even the nobles nearest the throne went pale, and still instinct bending their spines before their minds caught up to why, and Elise finally understood. The Alpha King standing beneath the royal banners was the man who had split firewood behind her bakery, burned her bread, and let Leo fall asleep against his shoulder beside the fire. The man who had shared her bed and disappeared before dawn was the king whose name the whole capital had been whispering for 3 weeks. Her chest went cold. For one long moment, she didn't know whether she wanted to slap him, curse him properly, or drag Leo straight back out the door they'd come in through. Victor didn't give her time to decide. His plan in ruins. Victor screamed the order to advance anyway, betting numbers against a king's aura. The main doors burst open from outside. Panicked nobles clogged the floor, screaming and stumbling into one another's paths. And before the royal guard could close ranks, the first rebels swept around Kellen's front and cut toward his blind side. Kellen turned to meet them, but the first release of his aura had left him unsteady. With terrified nobles between him and the charging line, he could neither unleash it again nor reach the doorway before the rebels broke through. Leo's hand closed hard around Elise's sleeve. She didn't have time left to be angry. She had one defense left, and she'd built it herself. She grabbed the cord hidden behind the service curtain and pulled. The flour sacks above the front hall tore open all at once, and white came down like a sudden blizzard indoors, swallowing the first wave of rebels whole in a cloud thick enough to blind them mid-stride. They staggered, disoriented, weapons swinging at nothing. Elise tore the burning torch from the wall bracket and threw it. The flame hit the cloud, and the world went white and orange in the same instant. Fire tearing open like a furnace door thrown wide. Elise felt the edge of it from 20 feet back. The blast threw the first line of rebels bodily into the courtyard, armor scorched and weapons ringing across the stone in every direction. The main doorway vanished behind a wall of smoke and flame that nothing was getting through anytime soon. For the length of one held breath. The entire hall went utterly quiet. No clash of steel, no shouted orders, only the low crackle of a dying fire over ruined flour, and the sound, faint and disbelieving, of nobles remembering how to exhale. Victor moved before the smoke had settled. Kellen's gaze flicked toward the service curtain for only a heartbeat, but Victor saw it. He followed that glance to the flour-covered baker and the child beside her. Then he snatched a fallen sword from the stone and turned toward them. Kellen saw where he was going. His aura struck hard enough to drive Victor to one knee. The sword rang from his hand, but Victor lunged anyway, half-shifted claws tearing through one glove. A growl rolled out of Kellen, low enough to vibrate through the stone. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, wolf-old eyes fixed on Victor. He caught him at the shoulder, turned the force of the lunge against him, and drove him flat against the stone before he came within reach of Elise or Leo. "Finished," Kellen said. This time. Victor had no army left to answer for him. With Victor pinned beneath the royal guard and the courtyard force broken, Kellen's aura pressed the last of the rebel line into surrender. When the final weapon hit the floor, Kellen's captain reached Elise beside the service curtain. She drew the cloth-wrapped jars from beneath her apron and placed them carefully in his hands. "These were meant for the vents and the food," she said. The men carrying them wore their badges upside down. So did the soldiers guarding the western stair. The captain's expression hardened as he looked from the jars to the false guards still kneeling near Victor. Orders moved through the hall at once. The men wearing reversed badges were disarmed and taken before any of them could shed the stolen armor or disappear among the real palace guard. Only then did Kellen turn, searching through drifting smoke and settling flour for the one person he'd promised himself he would return to the moment the last of this was finished. He found her where the smoke thinned beside the service curtain, holding Leo close. There she was again. The reason he was still breathing at all. Whatever composure had carried him through the battle didn't survive the sight of her. He crossed the ruined hall without a glance at the guards trying to fall in around him, without a word for the nobles staring in open disbelief at the sight of scorched armor, ruined flower, and a king walking straight past his own throne toward the service curtains. He went down on one knee in front of a baker, and her flower-dusted son in the middle, of a room full of the people whose good opinion he was supposed to need most. Somewhere behind him, a noble's wineglass hit the floor, and nobody moved to clean it up. 7 years ago, he said, loud enough that no one in that hall could pretend not to hear it. I met a woman in a silver mask. On the one night a year, I was allowed to be no one in particular. I've spent every year since searching every city I could reach and finding nothing. He looked up at Elise, and his voice, steady enough to command a battlefield only moments ago, came apart slightly at the edges. I found her again 6 weeks ago when I was half dead in an alley, and she saved my life without knowing who I was. You could have told me, Elise said, and it wasn't quite forgiveness yet, but it wasn't nothing either. I could have. I should have told you the morning I left, and I chose the throne instead because I was terrified of what a city microvolt would do to the two of you if I brought you into it before it was safe. He bowed his head lower. That reason doesn't make the hurt smaller. I let you wake up to an empty bed twice in one lifetime, and I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing to forgive. He turned to Leo before Elise could answer, and something in his bearing gentled considerably. The king folding down into something closer to a man, asking a much harder question than any he'd faced tonight. I won't ask you to call me anything you're not ready for, Kellen told him, but I am your father, and I've already missed 6 years of it. I'm asking for the rest of my life to earn that word properly. If you'll let me try. Leo studied him with the same frank, assessing stare he'd given a dying stranger in a snowy alley 6 weeks before. You still owe me a roll, he said finally. I gave you the last one in my basket, and you never paid me back. A ripple of startled laughter ran through the watching nobles, quickly smothered. And Kellen, who had stood rigid through poison, battle, and a public confession without once losing his composure, finally lost it to a real, helpless smile. That sounds like a serious debt, he said. It is? Then I'll owe you bread for the rest of your life, Kellen said. Starting tomorrow. Good. Leo considered him a moment longer. I'll call you Kellen for now. Kellen, then Elise is my true mate, Kellen said, rising enough to face the hall, his voice carrying to every noble still catching their breath along the walls. And Leo is the only crown prince this throne will ever know. Let any man here who doubts it say so now to my face, instead of in whatever letters Victor was sending before tonight. No one said anything at all. Then quieter, turning back to her alone, all the crown weight gone out of his voice entirely. If you want it, I'll lay the crown at your feet. If you want your bakery instead, I'll stand guard at its door and never ask for more. If you want me gone, I'll protect you both from as far away as you need me to be. The silence that followed broke on Leo's voice, flat and entirely serious. If you leave again, he informed Kellen, I'm locking you in the flour bin. Kellen bowed his head, grave as any oath he'd ever sworn. That's only fair. Elise laughed before she'd finished crying, which felt about right for how the last 6 weeks had gone. She crossed the last of the distance between them, brushed a streak of flour from his shoulder, and let herself mean it when she said the only thing that mattered. Then start by taking us home, Your Majesty. She took his hand in Leo's and didn't let go of either. And this time, don't disappear before breakfast. Outside. The snow had finally stopped falling. For the first time in 7 years, the walk home didn't feel like walking away from anything at all.